I think about the Gospels a lot, every day. I could say all the time, that would be exaggerating a little bit, but I do think about them every day. In fact, I read them most days. And of course, one of the things I think about, as I think every Christian thinks about from time to time, is the differences between the four Gospels. You have the three synoptic Gospels, which are similar but have a lot of difference between them: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then the Gospel of John, which is kind of there on its own. It's kind of its own unique thing going on there. And I think about what was the influence on these writers as they composed and wrote down their Gospels, and what are the reasons behind the differences between the four Gospels. Now, this is something that's on my mind a lot. I could say a number of things today, and I would have more to say the next day, but I wanted to get this out there to you, any viewers who are watching this, so that you can engage with me in this conversation about the Gospels, and we can get this conversation started. So my take, and what I wanted to bring out right now in this video, is that I think the early disciples had a way of talking about the story of Jesus. They had a particular kind of message that they preached as they went from city to city, in the synagogues, in the public places, home to home. They had a common, similar structure to what they taught when they had to explain to people from the beginning, from scratch, who Jesus was, what, and why you should believe in Jesus. And they went about telling these stories, reciting these words from Jesus, telling the gospel to people all across the world. And I think that there came to be an accepted, inspired by the Holy Spirit way of getting the gospel across to people. When you had to tell someone who didn't know about Jesus, you had to tell them from start to finish why they should believe in Jesus. Well, here are the stories you tell them, here are the words of Jesus that you repeat to them, and here are the miracles that you tell them about so that they know the power of Jesus. And all of those stories had something about John the Baptist and the prophecies leading up to Jesus. They had certain of the miracles that Jesus did of healing, of casting out devils. They had Jesus's instructions on how you could be a part of his kingdom, what Jesus expected people to do. And they had the story of Jesus's death and resurrection. These were the elements that made up the gospel as it was preached. And early in Christian history, I think there was a way of telling it that ended up being recorded in what we call the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which seem similar. And I think that's because that was the acknowledged, accepted, and inspired way of getting the gospel across. That's why those three writers wrote it down in the way they did. Of course, there are major differences between those three synoptic gospels, but they all follow a familiar and similar form in the way they get across Jesus' commandments, Jesus' miracles, and his death and resurrection. They all tell in their own way Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. They all tell in their own way some of Jesus' parables. Again, there are differences between the three in which parables they tell. They all tell in their own way Jesus' prophecies about the closing of that age and about his second coming. So when we read those three synoptic gospels, we find a certain familiarity in what those three gospels are telling us. And I think that's how it was for the first decades of the early church. That is the gospel that they were familiar with. But there was, of course, a lot more to Jesus and his life, his words, and what the apostles and disciples experienced from their time with Jesus on earth. Not everything was being told in those earlier tellings of the gospel. There was more to it that, for whatever reason, was not included in the initial tellings of the gospel. But the apostles had those things in mind. They knew those words, they knew those sermons, they knew those stories. They treasured those things, and they wondered and they prayed about when and how they would get those out to the greater church. And the time came when John put his gospel into writing. I do think that John was aware of the gospel as it was being told, and as it had been distributed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I believe that John made a conscious decision, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to put down other things into his gospel, so that his gospel reads like one of those sequels that tells the same story, but tells the different parts that you didn't see in the first part of that novel or movie. So it all happens within the same chronology, within the same 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry, but it's different sermons, different miracles. And there is some very significant stuff in the Gospel of John, as we all know. And for whatever reason, I think, the Holy Spirit wanted to save that until after the first few decades of the Gospel circulating. Then this Gospel of John came in to add to the church's understanding. And I can just imagine, the first disciples, the disciples who knew those stories, how they would have talked to each other about these things, wondering, how are we going to get this across to the public? How will we tell, the story of Jesus talking to Nicodemus, of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead? When is a time to tell people about Jesus calling himself the bread of life? How do we get this across? And then that time came when John delivered his telling of the gospel. So again, I love thinking about this stuff. I love talking about this stuff. I wanted to get this video out there, get some kind of a back and forth started. What do you think about the composition of the Gospels and what went into them? I love each of those 4 Gospels in a unique, special way for each one. I will probably spend time talking about each of those 4 Gospels. My current favorite actually is the Gospel of Luke. What's your favorite Gospel? Why? Okay, let's talk about it. Leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.